Do you have a paranormal encounter you'd like to share with us? Send us an email with your story for a chance of it being featured on Weird World. In late 2019, an extraordinary encounter would forever change the life of Louisa Chapman, a dedicated nurse working at a nursing home in rural Minnesota. The events that unfolded on that fateful morning of November 18th would leave Louisa questioning her perception of reality and the limits of her understanding. Louisa, a 32-year-old registered nurse, had recently started a new position at the facility, located about 45 minutes from her home in a nearby small town. The nursing home, nestled near the picturesque shores of Lake Superior, offered Louisa the shift she desired and a substantial pay increase over her previous position. Typically, she worked weekend doubles, covering both evening and overnight shifts in grueling 16-hour stretches. However, on this particular weekend, she had agreed to work morning and evening shifts to accommodate the facility's needs. As Sunday night stretched into the early hours of Monday morning, Louisa found herself still at work, well beyond her scheduled shift. The night shift nurse, Ella, had arrived late to relieve her, but Louisa didn't mind. She was behind on her charting anyway, and used the extra time to catch up on her documentation. While performing the shift handover to Ella, a commotion erupted on the floor when an elderly resident had a fall. Louisa and Ella rushed to his aid, finding him sprawled on the floor, wearing warm socks that were not non-slip. Despite his protests that he was fine, protocol dictated that the resident be sent to the emergency room at a nearby hospital to check for potential hip fractures. The incident added to Louisa's workload, as falls were considered state-reportable events if they resulted in serious injury. It wasn't until sometime between 1 and 2 a.m. that Louisa finally clocked out, having worked nearly 20 hours on top of a 17-hour shift the previous day. Exhaustion weighed heavily on her, but she felt alert enough to make the drive home. Louisa's tiny car was far too cramped for her to consider sleeping in. She had tried calling her friend, who lived nearby, for a place to crash, but received no answer. With no other options, Louisa resigned herself for the winding drive home along the shores of Lake Superior. The route was familiar to Louisa, full of twists and turns that demanded her full attention even on the best of days. She loved driving along the lakeshore, finding the vast expanse of water both calming and invigorating. As she navigated the curves, Louisa realised she had forgotten her glasses at work. Normally, she wore them to combat eye fatigue when focusing on distant objects, but she often removed them while charting. Too tired to turn back, she pressed on. Passing through a small town, Louisa turned on an audiobook she had been listening to keep her mind engaged as she wound her way through the dense forests that bordered the road. About halfway through her journey, just past a small hamlet, Louisa encountered something that would defy explanation. As she rounded a bend in the road, a bright light, reminiscent of a powerful spotlight, pierced through the thick woods to her right. Curiosity piqued, she continued driving, her eyes drawn to the source of the mysterious illumination. As Louisa navigated another curve, she spotted a familiar sight, the carcass of a deer she had noticed the previous night, still lying on the shoulder of the road. However, what she saw next made her heart skip a beat. Standing over the deer was what appeared to be an unusually tall, thin figure in black, skin-tight clothes. The figure was kneeling beside the fallen animal, its back turned towards Louisa's approaching vehicle. Fatigue clouding her judgment and her vision starting to blur without her glasses, Louisa initially dismissed the figure's odd appearance. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the spotlight's origin, wondering how anyone could have manoeuvred a vehicle through the dense forest to reach this spot. As her car slowed to a crawl, Louisa attempted to pause her audiobook, fumbling with the touchscreen radio that seemed unresponsive to her tired fingers. Rolling down her window, she called out to the figure, now about 15 to 20 feet away. "Is everything okay? Need any help?" Her attention divided between the uncooperative radio and the scene before her. Louisa didn't immediately register the full strangeness of the situation. Finally managing to silence the audiobook using her phone, Louisa looked up, her gaze settling on the figure by the roadside. In that moment, reality seemed to shift, and Louisa's world turned upside down. The being she had mistaken for a man was clearly not human. As it stood and turned to face her, Louisa's breath caught in her throat. The creature's head and eyes were enormous, eerily reminiscent of the stereotypical alien depictions in popular media. However, this being was far from the hobbit-sized creatures often portrayed in films and television. It stood imposingly tall, its presence both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Louisa watched, paralysed with fear, as the entity began to approach her car. Time seemed to stand still, and she found herself unable to move, breathe, or even form a coherent thought. The world around her faded away, leaving only her and this impossible being. Then, cutting through the silence like a knife, Louisa heard a voice. It wasn't audible in the traditional sense, but rather a command that resonated within her mind. The voice, alien and yet somehow familiar, uttered a single word: sleep. In the blink of an eye, everything changed. The creature vanished, along with the deer carcass and the mysterious spotlight. Louisa found herself still in her car, now pulled over to the side of the road, with the engine idling. Disoriented and confused, she glanced at the clock on her dashboard, which now read 3:52 a.m. With no memory of pulling over or putting her car in park, Louisa sat there, her window still rolled down, the cool night air sending a shiver down her spine. Desperate for human connection and reassurance, Louisa attempted to call her sister, but received no answer. In a state of near panic, she dialed the nursing home, relieved when a voice came through the line. Under the pretense of inquiring about her forgotten glasses and checking on the fallen resident's condition, Louisa occupied her mind with the call, confessing that she had fallen asleep at the wheel and needed someone to talk to in order to stay awake for the remainder of her journey. Concerned for her safety, they stayed on the line with Louisa until she arrived home at around 4:30 a.m. Throughout the conversation, Louisa clung to the notion that she must have fallen asleep, despite the vivid and unsettling nature of her experience. The alternative, that she had genuinely encountered something beyond human understanding, was too terrifying to contemplate. In the days, weeks, and months that followed, Louisa Chapman would continue to process the events of that night. She kept the encounter a closely guarded secret, afraid of the ridicule or disbelief she might face if she shared her story. The experience left her with a profound sense of unease, torn between the rational explanation of extreme fatigue leading to a vivid hallucination and the nagging feeling that she had witnessed something truly extraordinary. The missing deer would seem to support her account that something strange and unexplainable did indeed occur on that early morning commute home.